So in this video, we'll work on the practice question for the second week. And so in this video, we will focus on the concept related to chapter 2 and the U.S. economy. So in the chapter 2, we learned for the U.S. what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce. And we learned so many different concepts such as GDP, per capita GDP. And so for this practice, we will focus on practicing how to calculate GDP per capita and how to compare US GDP with other countries. So first, let's look at the first question. So we first see this chart, and it listing all different kind of countries' GDP. And so there are 2010 gross domestic product. So the highest bar means that country has the highest GDP. So the highest bar is corresponding to United States, which means U.S. have the highest GDP, which is $14.6 trillion US dollar in 2010, and the next country is China, 10.1 trillion of US dollars. So after understand what's the meaning of this chart, and we can look at our first question. So in 2010, the world's total output or real GDP was roughly 70 trillion. So what percentage of this total was produced by two largest economy? And the second, how many times larger is the US economy than the China economy? So this is a very straightforward question if you know the basic math, and you can translate the question correctly to the math formula, and you can get the answer very quickly. So look at the first part. So the total output was roughly 70,000 trillion. And the question is, what percentage of this total was produced by the two largest countries? And then you want to use the percentage to as your you should represent your answer as percentage. So to answer this question, you have to know what is the total GDP for the two largest economy. So which is China and the U.S. So China is 10.1 and the US is 14.6 trillion, and so the total is 17 trillion. So in order to get that percentage, and you are using the numerator, you are using the two large economies' GDP as your numerator, and your denominator will be the 70 trillion. Since both of them are using the same measurement unit, which is trillion, so you can ignore the units. So the numerator will be 10.1 plus 14.6, and then denominator will be 70. Again, the reason I don't include in so many zero because both numerator and denominator have exactly the same measurement unit. So then if you're using the calculator, and you will find the answer for this question will be 35.29%. So the question here required two decimal place, so you make sure you will follow the requirement. So 75.29%. So this is the first part of this question. So that second part, how many times larger is the US economy than the China economy? So to answer this question, we only need to find using the US, find the ratio of US GDP to the China's GDP. Then we will know how many times larger is the US economy than China. So to answer the second part, you're using 14.6 divided by 10.1. Again, the reason I eliminate the trillion sign because they are measured under the same unit, and then you will get 1.44. Since the question required two decimal places, so I keep two decimal places here. So which means the U.S. economy is 1.44 times larger than the China economy. So this is the first question. And so it is relative to GDP, and we compare US GDP with the rest of the world. So now look at our second question. So the second question is related to the GDP per capita. And so first let's look at reading the chart. So obviously the highest bar is US, so which means US not only have the highest GDP, but also have the highest GDP per capita. In other words, US have the highest living standard. So the next one, kind of surprised because China was the number 2 in GDP ranking. However, if we look at GDP per capita, so the number 2 actually changed to Canada. So if you go back to look at Canada's GDP, so Canada GDP it actually is not listed. So, but when we talk about GDP per capita, Canada actually is the number 2 in the world. So now, how about China? China actually is number 369, number 10. So China was number 2 in regarding the GDP ranking. But when we talk about GDP per capita, China is only number 10. So now let's look at a question. How does per capita GDP in Russia stack up against Canada's in percentage term? So we have to express our answer in percentage term. So it's very similar as the question number 1, second question. So we only need to find the ratio. So the question here is which number should be numerator and which number should be denominator. So first, if you look at the Russia's GDP per capita, and you will find it's 19 $19,190 US dollars. But for Canada, it's $37,380 US dollars. So to find this ratio, you can see called the Russia stack up against Canada. So your numerator actually will be Russia's GDP 19190, and your numerator will be the Canada's GDP per capita, which is 37380. And again, you will convert it to percentage times 100%. And then if you are using your calculator, you will get 51.34%. So this is the answer for the second question. It is related to the per capita GDP. Besides the calculation, you have to understand that if a country have a very high GDP, it doesn't mean they have a really high living standard. Again, the living standard are also being impacted by the size of the population. So now let's look at question number 3. If U.S. GDP is increased by 4% and the U.S. economy produce $14.6 trillion, so how much more does U.S. produce? And second part, by how much does this increase the average income if the U.S. population is 100 million? So did you notice in this question there is a tricky part? So the GDP is measured under the trillion, but the population is under the million. So which means if we are doing any calculation, the measurement unit cannot be ignorant like the previous example. So first, let's look at first part. How much more does U.S. produce? So if the GDP will increase by 4%, so 4% of the $14.6 trillion, that will be how much more does U.S. produce. So the question here is how much more. It is not asking you for how much does U.S. produce. They ask for how much more. So you only need to calculate the increased amount of the GDP. So the first question will be 14.6 times 0.04. And here I didn't write down the measurement unit because I only have one unit, that's trillion. So then I will get 0.58, and now I have to include the unit. So this is a trillion. And then the next question, by how much does this increase the average income? Again, they only ask for the increased amount, so they are not asking you the new GDP per capita. They only asking you increased amount. So now we are looking for per person. So that will means you are creating a ratio. So your numerator will be the increased amount of your GDP. So which is 58 and 000. It is trillion 000 and 000. So the reason I wrote down those 0 because my denominator is measured on the million. So I don't want to use trillion divided by million without indicating the measurement unit. So in order to avoid a mistake, so I include all the zeros here. So denominator will be 100 million 100,000,000,000. So this is 100 million. So now we will start to cancel the zeros. So here, 3, I'm missing 2. So I'm missing 30 on the numerator. So now I hear 200 here, and 2 more here, 2 more here, and then I will end up like 5,800. So this is the third question of this practice question. So the last one. So this table is talking about average growth rate of GDP, population, and per capita GDP. So you see those numbers, 2, for instance, 2 for Americans GDP, 1.1 for population, 0.9 for GDP per capita. Keep in mind, they are all just growth rate, so they are not the values, it's growth rate. So the question here is actually related to we learned in the lecture that about per capita GDP. When we are having we have the increasing per capita GDP, that means the growth rate of GDP is faster than population. If the population's growth rate is faster than GDP's growth rate, and what we'll see is the GDP per capita's value will decrease. And so if GDP's growth rate equal to the population's growth rate, so we will see GDP per capita's growth rate will be 0. So, will not change. So now let's look at a question. How fast does GDP have to grow in order to raise per capita GDP in US and China? So in order to make sure the GDP per capita will increase, we have to make sure the growth rate of the population is no faster than the GDP's growth rate. So now, if we look at US, the population growth rate is 1.1. For China, the growth rate for the population is 1.8. So in another word, in order to have US GDP per capita is at least not decreasing, so the minimum growth rate for the GDP will be 1.1 for US. So for China, the population growth rate will be 0.8. So the minimum growth rate for GDP will be 0.8 for China if we want to see the growth of the per capita GDP. So that's the end of this video, and hopefully this will be very helpful in your second homework.